What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today we're going to be responding to a Frank Turek video where he supposedly refutes evolution or points out like 3 things that disproves evolution. And then he follows it up with some moving the goalposts or special pleading or something like that. I'm not exactly sure, but we're going to find out today. So if you're interested in how Frank Turek fails to disprove evolution, then please stay tuned. Alright, so as we all know, Frank Turek loves to do these like seminars or talks or something like that where what he does is he gives the talk and then he has a Q&A afterwards where he then cuts up each individual question that he receives in the Q&A, or at least the ones that are interesting enough, and then he puts them on his YouTube channel. This is one of those such questions. And so this particular young man has a question about how to refute evolution.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Kyle.
Hey, Kyle, go ahead.
I was just wondering, atheists, their main point is in evolution, like that's what they believe. You didn't really talk about that at all, so I was just wondering how or what way do you disprove the theory of evolution from a biblical and scientific standpoint?
Now, I have to say that saying that you can disprove evolution via biblical and scientific as if the two are intertwined is kind of a ridiculous idea. I mean, the Bible and science are kind of diametrically opposed. If you really think about it, I mean, the whole entire Old Testament has no supporting information in actual history or science. And then in the New Testament, if you don't consider the philosophical like things of the New Testament or even the Old Testament, you don't really have a lot of scientific things that you can pull from it. But a lot of creationists out there love to twist the words around to make it seem like they predicted cellular phones or the internet or electricity or something like that. My point is that to convolute the conversation by saying that the Bible has some sort of scientific merit or that the Bible gives us any kind of indication about scientific things is just a very confusing way to go about it and should be corrected at every point. But of course, Frank Turek thinks that both the Bible and science work together when they really don't.
Okay, we have a couple of chapters in the book on that, so I'll just give you the 2-minute answer. First thing, when you talk about evolution, you have to ask people, what do you mean by evolution? Because the word can mean so many different things. If it means change over time, count me in. We see that. If you mean microevolution, adaptation within a type, count me in. We see that. But if you mean molecules to man without any intelligence, count me out. Because I don't think there's evidence for it. In fact, I think there's evidence against it.
All right, so he's about to go into the evidence against what he calls molecules to man evolution, but I do want to insert here that everything that he just described is evolution. Evolution, at least in the biological sense, is just the change in organisms over a period of time. This results in many different types of life occurring, as we see in nature today. But you see, this is one of the games that creationists love to play. It's just word games with what evolution is. He disagrees with macroevolution, but he agrees with microevolution. But he doesn't understand the fact that microevolution is still just evolution. Macroevolution is still just evolution. Just because you can point out like adaptations within a single species versus the macroevolution of changing species, just because we can delineate those doesn't mean that those are different types of evolution or that one evolution exists while the other one doesn't. Like I said, this is just a word game for them. And it's the only way that they can really rationalize around the fact that evolution definitely shows that the Earth is not young, that all life originated from single-celled organisms some odd 4 billion years ago, and their supposed inerrant book has a lot of errors in it.
Let me just give you a few reasons to believe that the Darwinian, neo-Darwinian view of the world doesn't make sense. Number one, believe it or not, is the fossil record. The major body plans appeared instantaneously, virtually, in the fossil record called the Cambrian Explosion. They just pop into existence, it seems, without any fossil precursors.
Now, this is either ignorance on Frank Turek's part or just a straight up lie by Frank Turek. There are fossil records of organisms existing prior to the Cambrian explosion. We've been able to find those. This has actually been disproved since 1947. And if you want to learn more about the Cambrian explosion and just in general how creationists are very, very wrong about everything that they say about the Cambrian explosion, I have a couple links in the description from Jackson Wheat, who spent 2 videos going over the Cambrian explosion. It's got a lot of great information in it. I definitely suggest going and checking it out. But basically what he said here is just a flat out either lie or just shows how much he doesn't understand about the actual fossil evidence. Because like I said before, we do have fossil evidence of creatures existing prior to the Cambrian explosion, and there's the pure fact that there were no land animals during, like, most of the Cambrian explosion. Like, the land animals didn't come until much later. Prior to that, we have just sea creatures, and that's where the Cambrian explosion originally started out at. What he said here was that all major body plans appear in the Cambrian explosion. And it's very specific wording that he uses here because he says body plans. And what I think that he's actually doing is distilling down like body plans in general to such a small set of similar things that he can then say that they all just appeared right here. Also, another thing is that the Cambrian explosion happened over millions and millions of years. So even by creationist standards, that doesn't work in favor for them. I don't know why they think they can use the Cambrian explosion as a sort of gotcha for evolutionary science. It's really not. But the fact of the matter is that there was life for about 3.3 billion years prior to the Cambrian explosion. We know this phylogenetically as well as through the fossil record. So he's just simply wrong on this point.
This is what Stephen Meyer talks about in his book called Darwin's Doubt, because this is the doubt Darwin had. He said, look, why aren't all these geological strata filled with all these intermediate types if my view is correct? And he said, well, if we keep searching the geological strata, one day we're going to find all these intermediate types. Well, we've been searching it for 150 years and we don't find that.
In case you guys didn't know, Stephen Meyer was the scientist that recently appeared in the PragerU evolution video, where he supposedly debunks or gives you a couple reasons as to why evolution doesn't make sense. Now, personally, I feel like he more looks like a Twilight vampire reject, but he's also very, very wrong on this particular point with Darwin and his hypothesis here, because what Darwin actually said was that his theory of evolution, or his hypothesis of evolution, would be discredited if we couldn't find these fossils in the fossil record. And wouldn't you know it, we have found them. It's what evolution predicts, and that's what Darwin was talking about, not what Stephen Meyer or Frank Turek want to twist his words into. He was merely saying that if we don't find these transitional fossils, then evolution is debunked, or evolution doesn't make sense, or it's been proven wrong. That's all he was saying. But, of course, we found transitional fossils. Frank acts like we haven't found transitional fossils, or the idea that we have to find all transitional fossils in order for evolution to be correct. We don't. We just have to be able to find transitional fossils in the fossil record, and we have done that.
Also, there's something called irreducible complexity, that things can't evolve in a gradual manner and still have function. All the parts need to be there at the same time in order to have something that's in working order.
This has been thoroughly debunked by, studies and papers and everything like that actual scientists have done, where they've removed key components of, for instance, the bacterial flagellum. There are actual scientific studies where they remove certain proteins from the bacterial flagellum, and the bacterial flagellum didn't just go away, it just changed the motility, like how effective it was at moving the cell around. That's all that it did. You saying that irreducible complexity is an actual thing, and that there are some structures that needed to come into existence working all together all at once, it's just either a lie or just a display of how ignorant you are on the actual science of this. Because, like I said before, bacterial flagellum, the one that creationists love to tout out, saying that, this has to all work together. It had to all come into being at once because otherwise it just wouldn't work. That's been thoroughly debunked, and it's actually been shown that through a single gene's duplication, you can get a bacterial flagellum. So I don't want to hear this shit about irreducible complexity. It's not an actual scientific idea that holds up to scrutiny.
Also, there's a new discovery, relatively new, called epigenetic information, and epigenetic information is the structure of the cell. They used to think that DNA was destiny, that if you could alter DNA, you can get any body type you want. Now we know that's not true. You can mutate DNA from now till doomsday, you'll never get a new body plan, because you need the structure of the body plan, not just the DNA, and DNA doesn't give you the structure. In fact, you could liken DNA to a software program and liken epigenetic information to the wood and nails and wires and cement that puts together this room. The software might be or DNA might be the software that gives you the plan to create the room, but in order to create the room, you need hard materials to do so.
That is not at all what epigenetics is. It's actually quite funny the way that he tries to make this analogy here, because it just simply doesn't work at all. Epigenetics is basically the expression of genes and how those gene expressions can change over time. There are some dramatic examples of how epigenetics changes like our bodies or the physiology of some organisms, like with pregnancy or other such things like that. You have these epigenetic changes that end up changing, things around you. It's also been shown that like your diet, your environment, and things like that can actually change these epigenetic markers. And while in the past we have thought that the epigenetic changes were completely erased during the reproduction phase of our life cycle, it's actually been shown that some of these epigenetic changes continue on through our offspring. But to liken DNA to a computer program is, of course, a fallacious way to go about it. They always want to say that DNA is a program, but I would say that if you were going to use some kind of like building analogy or something like that with epigenetics, what you would say is that the DNA is the genetic code, right? But what you would do is for every single worker or construction person, builder that is building a small segment of this building, you would give them the full and complete plans to it. But then what you would have in there are these tags that tell you which part of that particular building plan you are tasked with building. And that is roughly what epigenetic tags are in our genetic code. It's about what genes get expressed. And I have to say, I know that this is probably going to be like, oh, that's just GE again, but whales are a good example of how genetic changes can modify a body plan, as to use his wording here. Because originally, land quadrupeds existed and then moved into the water, and as they adapted to that new environment, they eventually turned into stuff like dolphins and whales. That is a complete body plan change, and it's not just because of epigenetics or anything like that. Epigenetics, like I said, just changes how the genes are expressed and what genes are expressed, while genetic changes are the fundamental blueprint changes of the organism. So what this all comes down to, though, is basic chemistry. As you change parts of the chemical reaction, it's going to react differently, and that's pretty much what's happening with these epigenetic changes as well as genetic changes. All in all, Frank Turek doesn't understand what the fuck he's talking about here with epigenetic and genetic changes, and his analogy doesn't actually make any kind of fucking sense.
And DNA doesn't give you the hard materials. There's genetic limits to change. That's another problem. Even using all of our intelligence to breed, say, different types of dogs, we can't break the genus of dogs. We run into genetic limits.
No, I don't even know what a genetic limit would be. Could you expound upon this in a different question and answer section? Like, what in the world are genetic limits exactly? Would this be the genetic point where you start getting like cancer and everything like that, or you get all of these genetic deformities or something? Is that what you mean by genetic limit? Because I mean that happens in a lot of species, so I don't think that they're at their genetic limits. Like I said, I don't even know what that would look like or even mean. Basically, what you're doing is restating in a dipshit way what the law of monophyly is. Using your dog example here, no matter how much a dog changes, it will still be in the family of Canidae and be a part of the subfamily called Caninae and would be part of the genus Canis. So no matter how the dogs change now, they will still be part of that particular clade. But that doesn't mean that they will always look in the same way that we see them now. They could change in several different ways to produce a different type of dog. But like I said, the law of monophyly, or this idea that you can't go from a frog to a human or a dog to an insect or something like that, like this is well-known science, and evolution doesn't require that particular kind of route to happen, and it doesn't even entail that. That is nowhere in the evolutionary theory.
Well, if we can't, using all our intelligence, break genetic limits, why should we expect an unintelligent process to do so? I don't think we should.
I don't think there are genetic limits. And I also don't see, like, how are people trying to break these genetic limits? I have no context in which to actually judge that particular statement in, because I don't know what you mean by us, like, trying to break these genetic limits. It's kind of hard to break a limit when it's not even fucking there.
But let me hasten to say this. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that macroevolution is true, that the Darwinists are right, that this Darwinian viewpoint is true. Does that mean God does not exist or Jesus didn't rise from the dead? No.
I would agree with Frank here. It doesn't matter if evolution is reality or not, although, I mean, obviously it is reality, but it's neither here nor there in this particular part of the discussion. It doesn't matter if evolution is true or not. That doesn't mean that a God doesn't exist. That doesn't even mean Jesus didn't exist or he's not the Son of God. But what it does mean is that the Bible is not inerrant, and you have to come to grips with that. Of course, creationists and apologists like Frank Turek aren't going to give you that. They're going to give you some kind of fallback so that you can, move the goalpost of your belief and come to some kind of understanding with what science is telling you. It's how religion has changed all throughout time.
So even if they're right, it doesn't affect whether or not Christianity is true. It might create problems for biblical inerrancy in the Old Testament, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And let me say one last thing about this. Even if macroevolution is true, it requires God. Why?
I would say that it doesn't. It doesn't require God, because every natural process that we can cite as an example here, we don't need a God in order for that natural process to happen. Like rain, we don't need a God for that to happen. Lightning, we don't need a God for that to happen. Planets forming, we don't need God for that to happen. We've seen them form. We've seen, solar systems form and stars explode and stars form and all this other stuff. We've seen those things, and it doesn't require God's hand in order to do it. But Frank here is about to yet again move the goalposts and special plead his way back into his particular faith.
Well, because you need a universe in order to have biological evolution. And you need the laws of nature to be what they are to drive evolution, and that requires a mind to keep them going in the direction like we spoke earlier. So you don't get rid of the need for God even if macroevolution is true.
And I mean, I would disagree. As soon as we have a natural explanation for something, that means that we don't need a God in order to explain it, because we haven't concretely said or proven in any kind of way that God is necessary for nature to be a thing or for reality to be a thing. And that's essentially what Frank is saying here, that regardless of whatever scientific concept is proven and what that means for Bible inerrancy or biblical inerrancy or anything like that, it still requires a God, because God is required for reality or for nature to happen. And there's nothing to suggest that God is required for nature. And at this point, how do you really differentiate between your God and just nature? It kind of seems like maybe God is nature, or maybe there's just no supernatural being at all. When God conflates itself with nature to the point of not being able to distinguish that God from nature, at what point do you just honestly sit there, take a critical look at it, and be like, so why do we even need this God as an explanation? I don't know the answer to that, because obviously I'm not religious. If you are religious, tell me, if you can't discern your God from nature, why do you hold on to that idea that there needs to be a supernatural being when it's no different than just the natural order of the universe? But that is all that we're going to hear from Frank Turek today. I hope that you heathens have enjoyed it. If you will, please leave me your thoughts down in the comments below. We heard from Frank Turek about the few things that he thinks debunks evolution, but even if evolution turns out to be true, he's still going to hold on to his faith for reasons. Let me know what you think about all that down in the comments. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like anti-creationist content like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.